$10 billion. That's how much India has pledged to a landlocked African nation once forgotten by the world. But this isn't another story of the dependency or debt. This is Burkina Faso, a country rewriting the script of African destiny under one of its most defiant and visionary leaders, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. While most developing nations accept aid tied to conditions, Traoré did the unthinkable. He accepted $10 billion from India, not as a loan of submission, but as a partnership of empowerment. And he vowed that every drop of sweat, every blueprint, every brick of this new African canal would come from the hands and minds of Burkinabe engineers. This canal, stretching through arid lands long abandoned by progress, isn't just about water. It's about reclaiming control. About a people proving they can design, build, and govern their future without Western contractors dictating their destiny. As the machines roar and rivers are reborn, one question echoes across Africa. Can a single canal built by local hands and fueled by Indian trust reconnect an entire continent's spirit? Stay with us. This is not a story of aid. This is the story of African sovereignty in motion. For decades, Burkina Faso has stood at the crossroad of hope and hardship. A landlocked nation in West Africa, its vast plains have endured cycles of drought, poverty, and dependency. Foreign aid often arrived wrapped in promises and political strings. Roads were built, yes, but never owned. Projects were funded, but never free. Generation after generation watched their homeland remain a supplier of raw materials, not an architect of progress. Then came Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, fierce, unapologetic, a soldier who believed independence meant more than a flag. To him, true freedom was the ability to decide one's destiny, to build with one's own hands, and to shape one's nation without waiting for permission. Under Traoré's leadership, a new narrative began. He confronted the painful truth that Burkina Faso's rivers were drying, its farmers migrating, and its economy bleeding dependence. Instead of chasing the next IMF program, he envisioned something audacious, a canal that would reconnect regions, irrigate farmlands, and power trade across the Sahel. When global powers hesitated, India stepped forward, offering $10 billion in strategic partnership, not in dominance. Traoré accepted, but under one condition. No foreign company will build this canal. Only Burkinabe engineers will. That declaration shocked the international community. Analysts called it reckless. Citizens called it rebirth. For the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso's engineers became national heroes, working side by side with soldiers and farmers to dig a new artery of life through the desert. In a world accustomed to dependency, Traoré's vision became a message of defiance and hope. The African Canal was no longer just an infrastructure project. It was a symbol of continental self-belief, a turning point that asked every African nation, what if we stopped borrowing progress and started building it ourselves? It was a morning that changed Africa's narrative. Standing before thousands in Ouagadougou beneath the red, green, gold flag of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré declared a vision so vast it seemed impossible. We will carve a river through our desert, not to impress the world but to feed our people. The announcement of the African Canal project sent shockwaves across the continent. Stretching more than 900 kilometers, the canal would link the heart of Burkina Faso to trade corridors reaching the Gulf of Guinea. But this wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a declaration of sovereignty. For decades, the world had known Burkina Faso as one of the poorest nations on earth, dependent on aid packages that came with instructions. Yet here stood a young captain-turned-president, refusing handouts from Washington and Brussels. Instead, unveiling a partnership, few expected a $10 billion cooperative investment with India. Unlike Western aid programs, India's offer came without political conditions. It was framed as South-South collaboration, a concept of equals rather than dependence. In Traoré's words, they did not come to own our soil, they came to respect it. What stunned observers even more was his next decree that the canal would be built entirely by Burkinabe engineers, technicians, and workers. Imported expertise would be limited to training, not control. Universities were mobilized. Military engineers returned from the front lines to join civilian planners. Even farmers were invited to consult on water distribution models. The reaction inside the country was electric. In the markets of Bobo Dioulasso, traders hung posters reading Traore builds what others only promised. On social media, millions across Africa shared the phrase, "Let the desert bloom." But in Western capitals, the mood was uneasy. Analysts questioned whether a poor landlocked nation could handle such an enormous project without external oversight. US commentators called it a nationalist gamble. European media labeled it African populism. Still within Burkina Faso, a quiet revolution was taking shape, a return of faith in national capability. For the first time in generations, citizens spoke of our engineers, our water, our canal. Hope was no longer imported. It was being dug from their own earth. Yet, as optimism surged, so did the tension. Old powers rarely watch new independence rise without resistance. Across Africa, the announcement struck a nerve deeper than politics. It spoke to memory. From Ghana to Niger, from Togo to South Africa, newspapers hailed it as a dream long denied. In the streets of Dakar and Lagos, students marched with flags reading "Africa builds again." For a generation that had grown up under the weight of debt and dependency, Traore's defiance was oxygen. While African youth celebrated, Western chancelleries moved cautiously. In Washington, think tanks convened emergency panels, questioning whether the canal signaled a new axis of influence led by India. European Union diplomats expressed concerns about transparency, a familiar euphemism for discomfort at losing control. The IMF quietly suspended the debt renegotiation program, citing policy instability. American commentators were divided. Some admired Traore's courage, comparing his rhetoric to early revolutionary leaders. Others warned that the canal might become a monument to isolationism, arguing that without Western oversight, corruption and inefficiency would doom it. Yet even among skeptics, there was unease, a sense that something irreversible had begun. Meanwhile, India's role transformed the geopolitical equation. Delhi framed its $10 billion support package not as charity, but as partnership, funding local training, technology exchange, and renewable infrastructure along the canal's route. Indian engineers worked quietly with Burkinabe universities, creating the first ever joint African-Indian hydrology research program. It was cooperation rooted in mutual respect, not dominance, and that distinction reshaped global narratives. Back home, Traore addressed the nation again on live broadcast. The canal is not a project of concrete. It is a project of dignity. Those words resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Kenya, Tanzania, and Senegal, local leaders began referencing Traore's doctrine of sovereign development. The belief that African nations must build for themselves by themselves, with partners who honor their freedom. And so the African Canal became more than an engineering challenge. It became a mirror held up to the world, reflecting both the courage of a rising continent and the anxiety of those who once claimed to guide it. But the true test was still to come, when the first shovels hit the sand, and history demanded proof that faith alone could move stone and soil. When the first excavators roared to life on the dusty plains near Ohiguya, the air trembled not from machinery, but from meaning. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was more than the start of a construction project. It was the sound of self-determination breaking ground. Farmers arrived with their families to witness the moment. Some wept, others sang the old independence hymns of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once dreamed of African unity through self-reliance. Soldiers, engineers, and villagers worked side by side, their hands blistered, but their spirits unbroken. Traore himself was often seen walking among them in plain fatigues, under the sun, refusing the comfort of a presidential tent. Yet as the canal deepened, so did the political tremors. Western embassies began issuing concerns over regional stability. International financial institutions withdrew consultants. Funding pipelines for unrelated infrastructure mysteriously froze. Media narratives shifted from cautious curiosity to open skepticism. Headlines in London and Paris warned of an authoritarian drift and militarized populism. But inside Burkina Faso, the opposite was true. Civil organizations, students, and unions launched the Canal of Hope initiative, raising voluntary donations and supplies. Local radio stations broadcast daily updates on progress. For the first time, the nation's discourse was not about what outsiders thought, but about what Burkinabe could achieve together. As weeks turned into months, the canal snaked across dry valleys and ancient villages. Drought-stricken communities began preparing for irrigation. Children played near the half-built embankments, as if guarding a promise. The canal became a living symbol, a scar of struggle turning into a vein of renewal. But the price of sovereignty was steep. Rumors swirled of covert operations aimed at destabilizing the government. Imported fuel shipments were delayed. Cyber attacks hit state servers. Some of Traore's closest allies were targeted by foreign media smear campaigns. The message was clear: the world was not ready for an Africa that built without permission. Still, Traore refused retreat. "We are not fighting the desert," he said. "We are fighting doubt." As the canal stretched farther south, the fractures within Burkina Faso's political class began to surface. Old elites, those who had grown comfortable under foreign contracts and international grants, whispered that Traore's dream was too expensive, too risky, too patriotic. They warned that the canal will drain our treasury. But most citizens had already decided better: a poor nation that builds for itself than a rich one that begs forever. Street murals appeared across Ouagadougou, a hand of steel carving water through stone with the words "Traoré ne cède pas." Traoré does not yield. Inside parliament, tensions rose. Some opposition figures called for new elections. Others accused the president of turning Burkina Faso into a fortress of defiance. Yet in the streets, workers' unions, youth movements, and rural cooperatives stood firm. They understood the cost of independence, and they were willing to pay it. When power outages struck major cities due to sabotage, students volunteered to guard electrical substations. When fuel shortages hit, women in marketplaces pooled money to import local alternatives. Every act of resilience became a statement. This is our revolution, not his alone. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré faced sleepless nights. Intelligence reports spoke of infiltration, disinformation campaigns, and rising tension at the borders. But he chose visibility over fear, addressing the nation weekly, standing before the people, explaining every challenge with unshakable calm. "If I fall," he told a gathering of soldiers, "you must continue digging. Because this canal is not water, it is our future." That sentence went viral. It was painted on walls, printed on banners, shared across Africa. In time, international observers noticed something unsettling. A nation once divided by poverty had united through purpose. Civil participation rates soared. Agricultural cooperatives doubled. University applications in engineering and hydrology tripled. What began as one man's defiance had become a continental movement of self-belief. And when the first section of the African Canal finally filled with water, under the glare of the Sahel sun, thousands of people cheered, not for a government, not for a project, but for themselves. When word spread that India had committed $10 billion in developmental aid to support the African Canal project, the announcement landed in Washington and Brussels like a thunderclap. It wasn't just about money, it was about symbolism. For the first time in decades, a major African infrastructure project was being financed without Western conditions and built by African engineers. In Washington, the conversation shifted uncomfortably. Analysts of think tanks began asking, has America lost Africa? On primetime political talk shows, commentators argued whether President Ibrahim Traoré was a reckless populist or the embodiment of a new African pragmatism. We are witnessing the birth of a parallel world order, one U.S. correspondent warned. If nations like Burkina Faso can succeed without IMF loans, others will follow. The reaction in Europe was no less tense. French officials, still nursing the wounds of losing influence across the Sahel, labeled the canal a populist stunt with foreign backing. Yet on the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, the mood was jubilant. People wore T-shirts with the slogan, "Water over weapons," and shared drone footage of the canal online like a badge of pride. Meanwhile, Indian engineers arrived quietly, not as commanders, but as collaborators. They trained local teams, shared hydrological technology, and respected Traoré's insistence that Burkinabe leadership must remain at the core. New trade corridors began forming between Ouagadougou and New Delhi, exchanges not of dependency, but of mutual respect. This new alliance sent shockwaves through the halls of power. In the U.S. Congress, some lawmakers called for a reassessment of American engagement in Africa, arguing that neglecting genuine partnership had opened the door for others. Others insisted that Traoré's boldness was a temporary show, that Africa's structural weaknesses would eventually force him back into Western debt systems. But the tone in African media told another story. In regional broadcasts across the continent, anchors spoke not of loans or politics, but of hope, the idea that Africa could finally design its destiny with its own hands. The name Burkina Faso began trending across African news and social media feeds worldwide, accompanied by one recurring phrase. The canal is more than water. It's a mirror, where the world sees Africa differently. In the months that followed, India's $10 billion investment, Western think tanks struggled to make sense of it. Foreign policy, The Economist, and the New York Times all ran features questioning whether Ibrahim Traoré was engineering a new, non-aligned revolution. At first, their tone was dismissive. Editorials called the African Canal unsustainable geopolitical theater or a nationalist fantasy. Yet as satellite images began showing kilometers of completed waterways glistening through the Sahel, skepticism gave way to fascination. A shift occurred quietly in academic circles. Scholars of post-colonial economics began writing papers with titles like Burkina Faso and the Return of the Developmental Sovereignty. Conferences at Georgetown and Oxford discussed how Traoré's model, national labor, South-South financing, and rural mobilization challenged the logic of dependency economics. In Washington, however, unease lingered. Congressional hearings on strategic interests in sub-Saharan Africa revealed a rare bipartisan concern. If Burkina Faso could do this with India, what if others follow Brazil? And Argentina had already signaled interest in agricultural exchanges. Ethiopia offered to connect its Nile irrigation research. Even Venezuela proposed sharing energy resources for canal logistics. For decades, the United States viewed Africa through a lens of aid crises and counter-terrorism. Now it was being forced to view it through innovation, self-sufficiency, and alliances beyond the West. American media personalities began to soften their portrayal of Traoré. Instead of a soldier turned populist, he was now introduced as the young reformer reshaping African diplomacy. Talk show audiences, especially among older Americans who remembered the Cold War, felt an echo of nostalgia, a sense that somewhere in the world, moral conviction still meant something. He reminds us, one retired general said on CNN, of what it looks like when a nation fights for dignity, not dollars. Across Africa, the impact was seismic. The phrase African Renaissance returned to public discourse, this time not as an academic slogan, but as a lived reality. Burkina Faso, once a forgotten name in Western briefings, had become a headline of African news, symbolizing a continent no longer waiting for permission. And through it all, Traoré stayed silent, no grand speeches, no diplomatic boasts, as the steady rhythm of construction. The whisper of water against the Sahel earth, and the rising hum of a continent reclaiming its breath. It began with a single image. A satellite photograph taken by NASA and published without fanfare showed a glittering blue line cutting across the ochre plains of West Africa. The African Canal visible from space. Within hours, it flooded global social media. Commentators called it Africa's Great Artery. But the real shock came when the United Nations voted by a historic majority to recognize the African Canal as a continental infrastructure of strategic significance, the first such designation for a project led entirely by African nations. The resolution was co-sponsored not by France or the United States, but by India, Brazil, and South Africa, signaling a tectonic shift in world alliances. Suddenly, investment delegations poured in from Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even Eastern Europe. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as landlocked and impoverished, had become the gateway to a new Afro-Asian trade corridor. Global logistics firms rushed to study the route. Think tanks began drafting post-Western development models. In Washington, disbelief turned to calculation. A leaked policy memo from the State Department read, "The Traore doctrine, national self-reliance, through South-South collaboration, may redefine global influence in the 21st century." Meanwhile, on the ground in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré gave one of his rare addresses. He spoke not of triumph, but of duty. "We have not defeated the past," he said. "We have simply refused to repeat it." And for the first time, the applause that echoed across the continent didn't come from parliaments or palaces. It came from the people. From miners and farmers, from engineers and mothers, from those who had built the canal with their own hands. Months after the canal's completion, the first convoy of Burkinabe cargo ships glided down the new waterway, carrying not imported goods but homegrown grain, solar-engineered machinery, and refined shea oil. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso had entered production, not just consumption. Foreign observers struggled to understand how a country, once dependent on foreign consultants, had built a mega-project entirely with local engineers and military logistics. The secret, as Traoré revealed, wasn't money, it was trust in domestic capability. "They told us we lacked the skill," he said, "but what we lacked was permission, and we no longer need it." Across Africa, this declaration ignited a firestorm of inspiration. From Niger to Tanzania, universities began adding hydrological engineering to their curricula. Young Africans no longer dreamed of escaping abroad, they dreamed of building at home. India's partnership meanwhile evolved into a new doctrine of equal exchange, technology for sovereignty, not loans for leverage. Indian engineers worked side by side with Burkinabe experts, not as overseers, but as collaborators. This model began attracting attention from Latin America and Southeast Asia, where nations long weary of debt diplomacy saw a roadmap for liberation. As the canal stretched its influence beyond geography, turning water into diplomacy and trade into pride, one truth became undeniable. Burkina Faso had changed the vocabulary of development. And in that transformation, Ibrahim Traoré ceased to be merely a president. He became a symbol of Africa's refusal to kneel, of the will to rise, and of the simple thunderous belief that greatness can be self-built. Across the heart of West Africa, the African Canal now flows, a river carved not only through earth, but through history itself. Once dismissed as landlocked and dependent, Burkina Faso has become a symbol of self-determination, a nation that dared to build with its own hands. Ibrahim Traoré's vision turned scarcity into strategy. With India's $10 billion partnership, he proved that cooperation could mean equality, not control. The canal now feeds farms, powers trade, and inspires every young African who once believed progress could only come from abroad. Traoré never claimed glory. "Don't remember my name," he said. "Remember that we did it ourselves." Today the canal stands as a living monument, not to one man, but to a mindset that Africa's destiny belongs to Africans. Its waters reflect more than sunlight. They mirror a continent rediscovering its confidence, unity, and will to rise. This is not merely an engineering triumph. It is a renaissance in motion, a reminder that true independence flows not from aid, but from belief. Burkina Faso has changed its course, and Africa is following.